The Civil Rights Movement, 1877 to 1970. Now, I know some of you are probably thinking, wait a minute, shouldn't it be like 1956 to 1970 or 1960 to 1970? But of course, there's never been a time when African Americans, and other Americans for that matter, weren't pushing for their equal rights as Americans. The problem is, after the end of the Reconstruction movement in 1877, most of America quit listening until about the 50s and 60s. So that's why when we talk about the civil rights movement, we're really usually talking about the 50s and 60s, because I'm going to show there were elements of this all the way back to 1877. And of course, civil rights are the rights that we have, that we're supposed to have as American citizens, the rights that we have as civilians. And so we tend to think of it as rights for African Americans. But that's because African Americans were the largest minority for whom most of these rights were denied. But as we're going to see, women are going to be part of this movement. And Native Americans, Latinos, gay Americans are going to be part of this larger civil rights movement. So one of my arguments today is that we really are in a new civil rights movement, really the last 10 to 15 years. We're having more and more conversations about race in America and the fact that African Americans, for instance, may be experiencing a very different life than white Americans. And it's not just about race, I would argue. I think it's also about class. I think people in the middle class, like me and many of you, I think, not all of you, but some of you, and above middle class, I think we live one life, and people who are poor have to live a very different life, have very different opportunities. The way I've always explained it, is when I go outside and if I see a police car going by, my first thought is that police is protecting me. They're there to make sure somebody doesn't rob me. But for a lot of Americans, when they step outside their house and they see the police, to them, those police are checking them out. They're making sure you're up to no good. Not that they're protecting you from others, but in fact, and I'm not saying that it's always that way, but I do, and I know police officers who kind of say that in certain neighborhoods they're there to protect, and other neighborhoods they're there to investigate. And just that, whether it's real or not, that perception of even the police of the government is very different depending on which class you're in and which race you're in. And it's only been the last few years that we've really been having conversations about that. I think 2012 is when this really kind of rose to the surface with a guy named Trayvon Martin, a teenager, African-American teenager male, who was walking through a middle-class neighborhood in Sanford, Florida, with a cell phone, talking to his girlfriend, and a packet of Skittles. And one of the local residents approached him. There was an argument and a fight. We don't know the details because only two people were there. But the problem is only one is still alive. Trayvon Martin was shot and killed during that. We know Trayvon Martin did indeed, he was a troubled teen, and there very well may have been violence. He may have started it. But why was he approached to begin with? He was approached because he was black, male, young, walking through a middle-class neighborhood. So the assumption was this kid's up to no good. And in fact, the gentleman called the police and said, I'm tired of these guys getting away with it. I'm going to take care of the problem. He hung up, and 30 minutes later, Trayvon is dead. This sparked a huge conversation. Again, going back to, do young black males live very different lives than young, say, white males? And I think the answer is, for many, yes. And then on top of that, a year later, 2013, his killer was found not guilty. And I think a lot of people thought, again, is justice the same for everybody? Now, that particular case in itself, I don't think really matters. It's the conversation it sparked that mattered. And one of the things that began to be talked about, and I go to Britain every year. And when I was in Britain in 2013, this was a conversation. And then when the verdict came down, my wife and I just happened to be in Madrid, Spain. It was on the front page of the newspapers. This was a worldwide story. And one of the conversations that began to have wasn't really just about Trayvon Martin, but it was about this different experience. Many African Americans and other people of color, again, do feel that the police, the government, treat them differently. And whether that's true or not doesn't matter right now. If they think it matters, if they think there's a difference, that's important, and that needs to be dealt with. And that's what this conversation has been about. And again, at the bottom, you can see it says, Black boys' lives have value too. And of course, that ultimately, that conversation became this is one of the protests about, fears of police brutality. But that conversation, again, ultimately became the hashtag Black Lives Matter. A lot of people, especially non-African Americans, see that and they go, oh, so I think all lives matter, but these people only think Black lives matter. And that's not what it means. There is a word left off, but the word isn't only. It's a word that should be at the end. What it really is supposed to say is Black Lives Matter, comma, too, T-O-O. Because everybody knows white lives matter. When a white teen gets killed, that's a big deal. We all know that. And what they are arguing is, well, Black Lives Matter too. We need to have a conversation about Black Lives Matter. So the fact that this happened, but it's also, to me as a historian, the fact that so many people reacted on both sides means there's something there. It's picking at a scab in American society that has been there for a long time. Because if it really didn't matter, then most people would just like, whatever. But the fact that I guarantee right now, some of you are going, I don't like this. Well, because that scab's being picked. The ugliness is being talked about that we don't always want to talk about. And that's what civil rights movements are all about. But it's not just about Black America. It's not just about race. It's also about things like women's rights and gay rights and other types of rights. So, for instance, for a long time we've been having conversations about who can get married. A lot of people say, well, only men and women should marry each other. But what about the 15 to 20% of people who identify as gay or bisexual? Should they be allowed to marry who they love? And actually, according to the Supreme Court, the answer has been yes. And for a lot of you, this has been sort of reality for years now. You may not realize how revolutionary this has been. Now, for some people, this will be very negative, but this is huge. And things like this, so much has changed in the last 10 to 15 years. That for older people like me, it's shocking. I personally support this, but I'm okay with people who don't. I mean, I think everyone's entitled to their opinion, but it's still shocking, whether you support it or not, just how fast society has changed. And we're starting to have a lot more conversations about things such as rape and sexual harassment, and again, different experiences for women versus men. And kind of coming out of the Black Lives Matter movement was another social media movement, the hashtag Me Too movement. Conversations about women being harassed on their jobs, being sexually assaulted, in some cases raped, and not a whole lot being happened because there was this kind of conspiracy of silence. If you talked about it, you got fired. You weren't hired in new jobs. And so this kind of sparked this idea, if women who've experienced this, if we all talk about it, we can't be ignored. So this sparked this idea of, me too. I too have gone through this, and we're still feeling the effects of it. It's only this year that Harvey Weinstein was convicted of some of these crimes. And I think, again, recording this in April 2020, we're beginning to see, I think, a lot of conversations coming out of the pandemic, because it is starting to affect people in different ways. We're seeing huge numbers of minorities seem to get this. And I know I can almost hear people saying, well, you trying to tell us the disease is racist? Of course not. But if it's in a society that's not completely equal, it will affect people differently. In the same way, tornadoes. And in fact, I'm recording this the day after a major storm just went through the South, and 18 people died in the South. And it does seem to be people who live, say, in trailer parks seem to get hit worse. And it's not that tornadoes hate trailers, it's that trailer parks, first off, most people who live in trailers don't have as much money. That's why they're living in a trailer as opposed to a house with a foundation. But also trailer parks, because they're cheap, tend to be located on cheap lands that are more prone to flooding, lands that are more prone to tornadoes. So yeah, the natural disasters do have this human quality to them. And we're seeing this with the pandemic. I get to stay at home, socially isolate myself because I can continue to do my job from my home. A lot of people, especially poor people, have jobs. They can't do that. They have to work. They have to go to jobs. So it tends to be more Latinos, more African Americans, and more poorer whites that are doing these jobs. So we're beginning to see higher numbers of them getting this disease and dying from this disease. So one of the conversations that's already starting to emerge is, well, what about the lives of people who work for Amazon or Walmart? Why, you know, it's because they're doing what they're doing that some of the rest of us get to not get sick. And so this conversation is about inequality, which is ultimately what civil rights is about, making sure everybody has equal access. That's starting to be a conversation, and I think it's going to become more and more of a vocal conversation. So let's talk about the end of the story before I tell you the beginning of it. So if you look at the late 60s into the 70s and 80s, you see some vast changes. If you were to look at television in the 50s, it was pretty white, middle class white. By the late 60s and into the 70s, TV looked very different. 1969, a brand new TV show for kids, Sesame Street, began. These are clips. In fact, I'll have a real clip online, but these are some pictures from the very first episode. And you can see it was an integrated show. It had African Americans and Latino Americans and white Americans all living together in harmony. And this was kids' TV in 1969. So you can see, you know, from 49 to 59, not a lot changed, but from 59 to 69, publicly at least, a lot had changed. And really, throughout the 70s, we begin to see the effects of the civil rights movement. For instance, movies, something I love to talk about. We're starting to see more diversity. Shaft, the first film with a lead black actor playing a cop, directed by the first movie, directed by a mainstream Hollywood movie, directed by a black director, Burt Parks. And we start seeing more Gordon Parks. I said Burt Parks, didn't I? Excuse me. Gordon Parks was his name. We start seeing television shows such as Fat Albert or Different Strokes about, you know, shows about the lives of African Americans. And they weren't just playing the servants or some mugger or, most shows in the 50s and 60s might have one black character that comes on for a minute and then they leave. These shows were black people. There were comedies, there were serious historical shows like Roots, and these were big hit shows. I watched all of these. All of my friends watched these shows in the 70s and 80s. There were still black stereotypes in films, but the one difference is at least they were the ones, these were films made by African Americans, so at least they were the ones choosing how to show themselves. By the way, all of these had great soundtracks. If you're a hip hop fan, so much of modern day hip hop emerged from these movies. But it wasn't only about African Americans. We'd see other types of ethnicities now being portrayed for the first time in Hollywood in the 70s. People like Robert De Niro and Al Pacino, directors like Martin Scorsese, Italian Americans playing Italian Americans about Italian American lives, or Jewish Americans like Woody Allen and Al Pacino, again, talking about the lives of Jewish Americans. These kind of actors were in the past, but they never played ethnics, if you will. They changed their names. They played kind of neutral characters. Now they're openly being who they are. So we're seeing a lot more diversity in American society. By the 1980s, the biggest TV show was The Cosby Show. The biggest pop star was Michael Jackson. The biggest movie star, the biggest comedian was Eddie Murphy. Now, again, admittedly, most people didn't live their lives. Most people lived just normal lives. So we have to be careful of looking at popular culture and going, oh, everything's perfect. Because look, Bill Cosby was a big star. And by the way, I'm very aware that Bill Cosby is a part of the Me Too movement. Just ignore that for a moment. But it did at least show that there was progress being made. Although we do know in the 80s, this is the beginning of the gang problem. We start seeing the crack epidemic, the AIDS epidemic, which hit the black community very hard. There were still lots and lots of problems, but it was getting better. 2008, obviously, Barack Obama, is African American, was elected president. Now, some people have seen that as well. That's it. Racism's over with. Obviously, that's not true. But it did show that just barely 40 years after the assassination of Martin Luther King, we could have a black president. Something that somebody like Martin Luther King would have assumed would take at least a century to happen. Here it happened only 40 years later. So what other movements? That was a little bit about sort of the progress of African Americans after the Civil Rights Movement, but we see this elsewhere. A lot of people forget, especially when you go to Texas and New Mexico, Arizona, California, that segregation there wasn't only about African Americans, but also about Latin Americans, in particular Mexicans. So we do see a Latino civil rights movement emerge in the 50s and 60s. Sometimes it was called the Chicano movement. Now, I'm not Latin American, so outside of this lecture, I don't use the term Chicano. It really just is the short version of Mexicano Americano, Mexican American, but it is a derogatory term. Um, but this movement was, again, to elevate the lives of Latin Americans. But notice that the symbol of it, it was a black power fist. That was a symbol in the late 60s. So a lot of these movements are modeling the black civil rights movement and using their methods of silent protest and getting laws changed and raising consciousness about them. Also, the women's movement, which in the 70s was called the Women's Liberation Movement. And even today, you'll still hear people talk about women liberals. But people like Betty Friedan, you see here in that photo on the left, who kind of helped start this movement in the 50s and 60s, was a major player here. One of the terms was the personal is political. So for women, they had the right to vote. They were supposed to be treated equally. But of course, the reality was women didn't have the same access to jobs and equal pay. They often weren't promoted like they should have been. Movies, TV still very much sort of objectified women. And so the idea was, let's talk about the personal lives of women and show that things like sexual harassment, a term created in 1975, is a real thing that needs to be talked about. One thing I purposely have this photo of the woman with the bra. There is this myth that quote unquote women liberals burn their bras. That's actually not true. There was one protest of Miss America, and that's what this is a photo from, but they did burn a lot of what they consider to be demeaning clothing for women, and included a couple of bras, and that turned into this idea that they all burned their bras. That's not true. But we also see an American Indian movement. Again, Native Americans become citizens in 1924, but their lives were still very marginal. So they were really pushing for more awareness, better education, better health care for Native Americans. We see an environmental movement that started in the 50s with Rachel Carson, but starting in 1970 with the first Earth Day, we begin to see sort of taking the methods of the civil rights movement of marches and protests and trying to get laws changed, that we started getting things like the Environmental Protection Agency and the Endangered Species Act and laws about conservation and the Clean Water Act and all of this. And of course, today, even though we still might debate about climate change, I think almost all Americans support things like, let's conserve animals. I mean, especially if you're a hunter or a fisher, you absolutely support those laws because you want your kids to be able to hunt deer and fish for bass. Because if we don't conserve today, we won't have them tomorrow. And we all want clean water. So then we get something that we still see today. The gay rights movement really began in 1969. Stonewall was a bar in Greenwich Village, New York. This is a time when most places being gay was literally illegal. And so the police busted this Stonewall bar because it had gay people in it. And they just said, enough. African Americans are getting their rights. Women are fighting for their rights. We should too. So they protested. They rioted. And that really kind of sparked the gay rights movement. It was something that, has led to things like gay marriage and conversations about that. And I know it's still controversial and not everybody agrees for various reasons, but this is when that began. The animal rights movement, obviously some aspects of this can get pretty extreme, but I mean, look at 2020. Most of us, support humane societies and think animals should not be treated cruelly. Here in 2020, Tiger King's the big show on Netflix, and part of that show is about the treatment of large cats and how zoos should behave. Veganism is huge now. So many people choose not to eat meat, and a lot of them for animal rights. So this is something that has affected our lives that we see starting with the civil rights movement. And really, I think the last sort of new movement that emerged from the civil rights movement was the rights for those with what we used to say disabilities. Today we say challenges, but that and it ended with the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. And again, this I think illustrates this the best, what's driving all of this. And what it's all about is Americans being treated equally, not being treated better than somebody else, not getting special treatment, but simply having equal access, whether that means to the vote, jobs, education, that you should be able to succeed or fail on your own merits, not being somehow discriminated against because of something you can't help. So let me start with a story. The Civil War Centennial. In the 1960s, it was 100 years since the Civil War. War fought over race, over slavery. Um, the centennials, people love centennials because, people travel, they want to go, it's like in this case, people are going to go to Civil War sites, they're going to spend money, and they're going to buy toys like you see here. So the government was like, yes, let's organize this and let's coordinate this. And so there was a Civil War Centennial Commission set up by the federal government, which had representatives from all the states to kind of organize all of this. And in January of 1961, they were going to have their last meeting because, of course, the Civil War began April 1861 at Fort Sumter, just off the coast of Charleston. So in January of 1961, they're going to have one big last meeting before the first celebration. And it was going to be held at a hotel in Charleston. And again, there were representatives from all over the country, so that included African Americans. And this hotel, turned out, didn't allow African Americans in. And the federal government said, well, you kind of have to because this is part of a commission. And they're like, no, what, are you going to make us? And so John Kennedy, an Irish American, he was, and people forget Irish Americans used to be discriminated against. It was a big deal when he was elected, the first Catholic president and the first Irish president. Anyway, he was very sensitive about discrimination. So he decided we're going to hold it at a federal building in Charleston. But there was such a hoo-ha over this that some of the Southern Civil War Centennial members backed out. In fact, I recently did a chapter for a book, and I talked about this for Florida. And I actually saw some of the correspondents in Florida. They were like, that federal government's not going to tell us what to do. And they stormed out. And what ended up happening is the southern states seceded from the Civil War Centennial Commission. 100 years after the Civil War, we're still divided. We're still divided. And it's really getting back to race. And what is the legacy of the Civil War? And it really, if you talk about today, the Civil War, there is a racial component to this. When people see the Confederate flag, they have very different feelings, whether they're Southern or Northern, whether they're white or black. And again, you look at most Civil War Centennial reenactments, and that's Centennial, just Civil War reenactments, and it's pretty white. And, here is a photograph in Florida of Northern and Southern Civil War veterans in 1909 coming together, reconciliation. Notice who's not there? African Americans. Civil War memory has always been very white. And that's not an accident. That is on purpose. This is the United Daughters of the Confederacy, the UDC. They shaped a lot of the Civil War memory, and they basically wrote out. They did a lot of great preserving. As an archivist, I love the UDC. They saved a lot of letters that never would have been saved. But at the same time, they also literally whitewashed much of this history. They took out the slavery aspects of it. They took out the African Americans out of it. And which is one of the reasons why Civil War memory is still so controversial today. And it's not just about the Civil War. It is also about us. And, and it does seem to go back to race so often. Again, I just mentioned I wrote a chapter for a book. It came out last year. And part of that was about Civil War memory in Florida. And in Florida, we had one big battle, the Battle of Vallusty, which is a state park today. And there's a big memorial, you see it there, for the Civil War Confederate soldiers. So recently they thought, well, we'll put up a memorial for the Union soldiers, which included black soldiers. Well, there was a massive protest. And people, and it's just unbelievable. 2014, people are still arguing over this and not wanting to be inclusive. And so, again, even in our generations, we still haven't gotten over some of this stuff yet. All right, let's talk about the the Civil Rights Movement proper. So, by the way, this is a photograph of young activists in Tallahassee. These mostly were some FSU students, mostly FAMU students, talking about segregation in Tallahassee, Florida. But let's talk about the Civil Rights Movement. Again, it really begins the moment Reconstruction ends. And African Americans took several approaches to this. One, some of us have talked about already, Booker T. Washington, a former slave from Virginia. He obviously wanted immediate change, but to him, he said, we're not going to get immediate change. We were lucky to get freed, but what we can do is we can educate ourselves, we can earn our own money, buy our own land, be totally self-sufficient, and then hopefully, gradually, we'll be brought into mainstream America, and maybe in 100 years or so, we'll be president. Who knows? Unfortunately, that turned out to be right. Unfortunately, meaning it did take over 100 years. But others, like W.B. Du Bois, who was never a slave, he was born 3 years after the Civil War, born in Pennsylvania, had a very different attitude. He was our first black PhD, although he didn't get it in the U.S. because he wasn't allowed. He had to get it at the University of Berlin, but he was a historian who wrote many books, including one of the first histories of Reconstruction. He was friends with Booker T, but he was a critic of him. He thought too gradual, too safe. He wanted immediate action, and he formed groups like the NAACP to challenge segregation. So he thought, what are we waiting for? The Constitution is very clear. We should all have equal access to the vote and to jobs. So we need to take these to court. As Jim Crow laws, segregation laws are being passed, we need to challenge them. We need to take them to court. And again, growing up, I always agreed with Du Bois. But the problem with Du Bois is you can sue anybody you want if the courts will hear your cases. And the problem was nobody was willing to hear these cases at the time. The other activists in the early 20th century, mostly in the 1920s, with a guy named Marcus Garvey. He's not as well known today. He was actually born in Jamaica originally. He pushed for the Back to Africa movement. His argument was, why are we staying here? They clearly don't want us here. So why not just leave and go back to Africa where we're from? The problem with that is, obviously, most African Americans are Americans. It's in some cases 300-400 years since their ancestors have come here. They're as American as anybody else. They don't want to go back to Africa. That's silly. So that part never took off too much. However, one thing he did talk a lot about was, let's quit trying to join mainstream white America. Let's celebrate Black America. And that aspect of Marcus Garvey did take off. In fact, in the 1920s, you get what used to be called the New Negro movement. Today, it usually is called the Harlem Renaissance. But you get people like James Weldon Johnson and Zora Neale Hurston, these poets, these novelists, musicians, jazz music really explodes at this time. And these are people who are writing about and painting and talking and researching the lives of Black America. They're celebrating being Black. And that was something new in America. But again, unfortunately, most African Americans still live very poor lives. And the Great Depression really revealed that to many people, especially down here in the South. The New Deal, if you remember, was the federal government's attempt to make the Great Depression not so bad. It did seem to favor white people more than others, but for the first time, African Americans, since Reconstruction, were beginning to get assistance from the government and in an attempt to improve their lives. Of course, the person behind this was Franklin Roosevelt, a Democrat. And this had political implications. Today, even though it's not absolute, but today, especially in the South, many, I would say the majority of African Americans in the South tend to support Democratic candidates. And even though it sometimes changes from election to election, but the vast majority of white Southerners do tend to vote Republican. It used to be just the opposite. Republican was the party of Lincoln, the party of Reconstruction. It was, in the South, the Black Party. Democrats was the party of Confederacy, the party of segregation. It was, if you will, the white party. That begins to switch starting in the 1930s because of things like the New Deal. And in particular, the fact that Franklin Roosevelt had an unofficial Black cabinet. These were Black scholars and writers that he would meet with about once a month, who would tell him about what's going on in the Black community. This was the first time that a U.S. president would spend significant amount of time listening to the Black community since Reconstruction. Another reason that we start to see a switch politically is the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, the woman on the left. She grew up very racist, as she would later admit, and supported segregation, but she changed as she got older. Um, Probably the most famous event with her involved the woman on the right, an opera singer, worldwide famous singer named Marion Anderson, who was African American. Eleanor Roosevelt invited her to sing for the Daughters of the American Revolution, the DAR, a group that didn't allow in African Americans. And it turned out they didn't even allow singers in because they wouldn't allow her to sing. Eleanor Roosevelt very famously publicly resigned from the DAR. Then she got her husband, Franklin, to allow Marion Anderson to sing in front of the Lincoln Memorial. A very significant symbolic spot. Lincoln, a Republican no less, who freed the slaves. And even to this day, when many political protests often happen in front of the Lincoln Memorial, especially if they have anything to do with race, this was the first time. And for so what African Americans began to think is, wow, maybe some of the people in the White House do actually care about our lives. So there is clearly something is changing. Not a lot, but it is changing a little bit. So we do begin to see the voting habits start to change. And there's a very famous book called Farewell to the Party of Lincoln that talks about this. But there were still problems in America. This is still the time of lynchings. Billie Holiday was a jazz singer who wanted to openly talk about these issues. So a songwriter from New York, a white Jewish American songwriter, wrote a song called Strange Fruit for her. If you don't mind, go ahead and stop it and go to the link to hear it. If you haven't ever heard Strange Fruit before, see if you can guess what it's about. And, if you think, she's in that song, she's thinking about strange fruit hanging from southern poplar trees and magnolia trees. And of course, she's thinking about African American men who were lynched and hung from trees. She was not allowed ever to sing in the South again in her life because of this. Because when she gave a concert, part of the contract says, I have to be allowed to sing the song. And she sang this all over the world and made white audiences very, very uncomfortable. And then, of course, World War II occurred. World War II, where African Americans, who fought in every war in American history, of course, fought in this war. But who were we fighting? The Japanese, the Germans, the Italians. Three countries that based their governments on racial superiority. So they were fighting not only to keep America free, but to also change American attitudes about racism. And that's why they called it double victory. But yet, even during World War II, there were some lynchings, including right where I live in Gadsden County, Florida, had a lynching in 1944. This was a flag that used to be hung at the NAACP headquarters anytime a story came out about somebody being lynched, to remind Americans that while we're fighting the Nazis, we should also be fighting racism right here in America. But we do begin to see real changes after World War II. Harry Truman, the Democratic president who replaced Franklin Roosevelt, he went for re-election in 1948, just barely won. That's why you get this very famous photograph, because the newspapers assumed he was going to lose, and they went ahead and pre-printed the headline showing that he lost when he actually won. That's why he's holding up that newspaper. But Truman, who was from Missouri, a former slave state, somebody who used the N-word in private conversations, was not, who you would assume is a major civil rights activist. But he believed in fairness. He would hear stories about African American soldiers coming back to America, having served in the army, being lynched in uniform, not being allowed to eat in certain restaurants, not being allowed to vote. He was furious. He couldn't do much. He was only president. But what he did do was he integrated the federal government, and he also integrated the U.S. military. And this was shocking to all Americans, and it had huge repercussions. And in fact, that election, 1948, one of the reasons he almost lost is because a brand new party developed, the Dixiecrat Party. They only lasted for one election, but they took a lot of votes away. They they thought, well, the Democrats are ruined now. If they're supporting integration, we're going to form our own party. And a guy named Strom Thurmond was in charge of this. They called themselves the State Rights Democrats. State rights, of course, is code word at one time for pro-slavery. By the mid-20th century, state rights was code word for pro-segregation. So Strom Thurmond obviously doesn't win, but then he goes on to be governor of South Carolina and then became a U.S. representative for South Carolina. What's interesting about Strom Thurmond, not only was he a virulent segregationist, but his private story is interesting. He died back in the early 2000s. He was still a member of the House of Representatives, although he was 100 years old at that point. After he died, a woman spoke up and said, I am his daughter, and I'm half black. It turns out that Strom Thurmond, back in the 30s, had a long, passionate romance, not just sex, but an actual true romance with a black woman. They were majorly in love. But it ultimately broke up because of the norms at the time, but she got pregnant and gave birth to a daughter. He never gave her his name, but he raised her like his own and made sure she went to the best schools in D.C., and then she worked for him all her life, even though she could never publicly say she was his daughter. His family, of course, the friends knew about it, but the public didn't know about it. It's on one hand, it's funny. I remember the first, like, oh, of course he had a black daughter. But then you go, how sad that is. Because he clearly loved his daughter. She loved him. And I think this is so revealing about America. This is so typical of our history, where on the surface, we're all about, at one time, segregation and keeping races separate. But even somebody like a Strom Thurmond privately was integrated. But yet, obviously didn't feel like he could publicly say it and never made an effort to publicly say it. And I think that so much of our history is much more complex than we ever want to admit. So after World War II, a movement truly begins. The NAACP, they've been trying to use courts this whole time, but it wasn't until the 40s that courts began to listen. So the Herman Sweatt case is the first of these cases. Sweatt was an African-American student at the University of Texas. And if you remember, the argument for segregation was Plessy versus Ferguson. It's okay to be separate if it's equal. Well, University of Texas didn't allow African Americans in. And they said, that's not right. You got to let us in. You could be separate, but you got to let us in. And I want to go to law school. University of Texas had a good law school. So they eventually went to court and they won. Sweatt was allowed to go to the law school, but he could only go to class by himself, sit in a classroom all alone, and professors would come in one by one and lecture to him all by himself. Clearly that wasn't equal. But again, what they're doing is they're taking the logic of segregation to attack segregation. And of course, the famous case is Brown versus Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas. So again, the reality was there were separate schools, but they were never equal. They were not equally funded. They didn't have the same qualified teachers. And some communities didn't even have black schools. So ultimately, what ended up happening is the Supreme Court system decided that's it. They have never been equal. Separate but equal does not work in reality. Ironically, one of the people who helped that case was a historian. Historians don't play much of a role in history, but C. Van Woodward, a Southern historian, showed that how not only that segregation has not always been, that it's a fairly recent phenomenon, meaning 1890s. It had only been around 60 years at that point. It's not how things have always been, but he also showed the inequality in segregation. And now we're going to start talking about the story of Emmett Till a year after the Brown versus Board of Education decision. Now, by the way, Brown versus Board of Education did not end anything in most places yet. Now, some of you in my face-to-face class, you've heard this story. And trigger warning, by the way, the next couple slides, we're going to see some very ugly things. If you've heard this story, you can skip ahead a little bit. But those in my online class, I know you haven't heard this yet. So Emmett Till was a 13-year-old kid. He had been born in Money, Mississippi. He unfortunately had an absent father, but his mother, Mammy Till, decided she was going to not live in Mississippi. She wanted to raise her son somewhere else. So they moved up to Chicago. Now he's 13. It's 1955. he wants to go back and just see his family one summer in Mississippi. So she reluctantly allowed him to go. This is they took several photographs before he left, and there he is. This is what he looked like. And she kept warning him. She said, Chicago may not be great, but it's not Mississippi. You be careful. Okay. So one day, he and his cousins go to the Bryant's grocery store in Money, Mississippi, and they go inside to buy a soda and some candy. And the woman running the cash register, Carolyn Bryant, apparently he whistled at her. Emmett Till, and some people say maybe said something a little bit rude, and then they ran out because again they're 13-year-old kids. When they got outside, the cousin said, "Oh my God, Emmett, you're in so much trouble. You can't talk like that to a white woman." And he initially was like, "Whatever," but he probably knew he had just screwed up. Again, things you do when you're 13. Well, that night at his uncle's house where he was staying, this house here, about midnight, a car drove up. Two white men got out, knocked on the door. Moses Wright answered, and they said, "We want to see that boy from Chicago." Moses got Emmett Till out of bed, took him to the front door. They turned to the car where a woman, probably Carolyn Bryant, said, "Yeah, that's him." Okay. And they took him away and drove off in the night. No one ever saw Emmett Till alive again. The talk of the town was pretty much they took care of that uppity kid from Chicago for saying what he'd said to Carolyn Bryant. But no body, no witnesses to the crime. More, this would just go along the lines of thousands of African Americans who disappeared in the night. And these are the two men, by the way. The guy on the right is the husband of Carolyn Bryant, and the guy on the left is her brother. But then a body was found in the Tallahatchie River. It had been tied down, weighted down with a big cotton gin wheel, but it had kind of come loose and floated to the top. Now, they were the last ones to see Emmett Till. It was clearly Emmett Till's body, although it could only be identified by the ring on its finger that his mother had given him. He was unrecognizable other than that. It was clear that the body had been beaten severely and then shot in the back of the head and then dumped in the river. So now there is going to be a trial. So there also has to be a funeral. His mother decided she's not going to put up with this. This is 10 years after World War II. We fought the Nazis. So she decided, I'm not going to cover this up. I'm not going to hide. I'm not going to just hold my head down. She decided to have an open casket. That's Emmett Till. And as I tell my students over and over, this is what segregation really looks like. Segregation is not about separate water fountains. Segregation is about power. It's about violence. This kid whistled at a white woman, and this is what happened to him. That is what the civil rights movement is ultimately really about. It gets worse. Now, again, 55 is not the same as 35 or 25. There is an active black press. So magazines like, for instance, Jet Magazine ran stories about the Emmett Till case, and they wanted justice. So a jury of their peers decided to try the case in Money, Mississippi. And despite the fact that Moses Wright testified that those two men did indeed come to his house and take away Emmett Till, the two men were found not guilty. By the way, the two men, they both died one died in 79 and one died in the early 80s, but Carolyn Bryant is still alive. Barely, but she's still alive today. Then it gets worse, even worse, because there's a photograph of Moses Wright actually testifying, the first African American to really do that, and he immediately ran away to Chicago. He was so scared. But because you cannot be tried for the same crime twice, now that they've been found not guilty, they can admit that they did it. So in Look magazine, they told the magazine exactly how they killed Emmett Till. So the combination of the murder, the publication of his photograph, and the fact that the men admitted to doing the murder, yet they were found not guilty, spurred on a lot of action. even white Southerners who may have supported segregation, even they were beginning to recognize this is not the America that they fought for. By the way, I did want to point out Carolyn Brown. They have even recently tried to bring her to trial, but there just has not been enough evidence because she clearly was part of that murder. But so the movement takes off, and it's actually because of the Emmett Till murder and court case that the Montgomery bus boycott began, which is what most people identify as the beginning of the civil rights movement. Of course, that was when a woman named Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on the bus. Buses, the blacks had to sit in the back and the whites got to sit in the front. You could sit in the front if you were African American, but only if a white passenger wasn't on the bus. Uh, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat and moved to the back, and she was promptly arrested. It was a planned thing. Sometimes it's told like it was just happened, but it was actually planned. And a reason why it was Rosa Parks, because she obviously in real life was very tough. But her image, this little demure woman, looks like a librarian with her little glasses. She, of course, was the secretary for the local NAACP. They knew that the arrest of her would have a much greater impact than arrest of, a big guy with big muscles or something. And of course, this is the idea of using economics to bring change. The Montgomery bus system, like most bus systems, are really a private company contracted out by the city. They make money through having customers. If African Americans choose not to ride the bus, which they did, you can break the company and therefore you can force change, which is what happened. And we start seeing bus boycotts all over the South, including Albany, Georgia, and Tallahassee, Florida. And what you start to see are several organizations form. A group called SNCC, the Student Nonviolence Coordinating Committee, the Southern Christian Leadership Committee, focusing on nonviolence, because the image of African Americans was, if we don't control them, they're going to be violent against us, like that Trayvon Martin guy, And yet, so they overemphasize their nonviolent aspect, civil disobedience, if you will. Organizing things like sit-ins, like in Greensboro, North Carolina. Diners like this, the majority of their customers were black, but only for takeout. So these young college students just sat in and said, we're not leaving. And again, forcing awareness, forcing change. Some of these sit-ins got very violent, like in Jackson, Mississippi. This was a biracial. You had both black and white protesters. And you can see the crowd around them. What always amazes me is the old guy on the left, approving this with a smile. They poured food on them, drinks on them, and then they dragged them out in the concrete and beat them up just for sitting in a diner. But because of Brown versus Board of Education, we do begin to see some changes. The first couple of years, nobody did anything. In fact, Virginia shut down all of its public schools instead of integrating. Arkansas decided to go ahead and integrate. They thought, what the heck? Let's go ahead and do it. We'll look like a good progressive state. Maybe businesses will move to our state. So 9 students were chosen from the black high school to go to the white high school. Everybody always points out, they always say, wait a minute, there's 10 people here. The woman, the first woman on the left, that's actually their teacher. The gentleman all the way on the back to the right is a guy named Ernest Green. He actually came to Bainbridge State College a few years ago and gave a talk. Anyway, they were supposed to, go to the school, and then ideally the next year, all of the students would go to the same school. And it was going fine and dandy until governors of other states, like Georgia and Florida and Mississippi, called the governor of Arkansas, a guy named Orville Faubus. And they said, what the heck are you doing? You integrate your schools. We're going to have to integrate our schools. Come on, man. So Orville Faubus wanted to get reelected. So he decided to call out the local National Guard to block the entrance into Little Rock High School, to not allow these 9 students in. But of course, that was a direct resistance of the U.S. Supreme Court, and President Dwight D. Eisenhower realized he needed to respond. He reluctantly federalized the National Guard to allow them to go in. And that was the whole plan of Orville Faubus. He knew that this was going to happen, but he wanted to look like he was resisting it. And this also made people, white segregationists, go, this is just like the Civil War. Federal government forced us to free our slaves. Now they're forcing us to integrate. And so what we start to see is a plethora of Confederate symbols emerging at this time. This is when the Georgia flag adopted the Confederate flag. Marvin Griffin, Governor Griffin of Bainbridge, Georgia, is the one that signed that into law. We start seeing real resistance to integration in the South. The Southern Manifesto, every Southern senator, except one, signed it, saying they would never, ever support civil rights. That one was a Texan named Lyndon Johnson, who would later go on to be president. So a lot of this repression and resistance was very violent. And again, we start seeing the use of Confederate symbols. Remember, just like your great-grandparents fought for slavery, we got to fight for segregation. And really, this is the moment when Confederate flags started to become very, very controversial. Yet, right after the Southern Manifesto was signed, Congress passes the first civil rights law since Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Act of 1957, which set up a commission to investigate voting violations. And what you'll notice is that this is almost always what it's about. It's usually about voting. Because if you can vote equally and have equal access to the vote, ultimately you will have people who represent you and everything else will fall into place. Even President Truman, as president, tried to investigate voting. But of course, he's president, didn't have a lot of power. This didn't actually do a whole lot, but it was a signal. These actions by SNCC, by the Southern Christian Leadership Commission, by the NAACP was having an impact. And the fact that the federal government was listening, and that, again, sparked other movements. So, for instance, in 1962 at Ole Miss, University of Mississippi in Jackson, Mississippi, James Meredith was allowed in, after a lot of struggle, was allowed to finally go to this university. First African American to go to an all-white university. The governor of Alabama, a guy named George Wallace, tried to resist. He very famously stood in the doorway and said, "Segregation then, segregation now, segregation forever." Then he very quickly stepped out and let the guy in. But he was just trying to get votes. I mean, he was playing the race card. By the way, that's a photograph of him in the center at the Gettysburg celebration. But this was the Southern version of the Gettysburg Centennial celebration. One thing I will say for George Wallace. Oh, by the way, for Orville Faubus, the governor of Arkansas, he got reelected 7 times based on what he did at Little Rock. George Wallace eventually got shot. He ran for president in 1972 and was actually shot. He didn't die, but he was in a wheelchair the rest of his life. In the late 70s, he did actually apologize for this. He's one of the only Southern politicians who actively fought integration, who then later said, "I was wrong, and I shouldn't have done that." And he was actually embraced by many in the Black community. So I just want to point that out because it is incredibly rare, and so it doesn't excuse what he did, but at least shows that he knew he was wrong. University of Alabama, 1963, Vivian Malone was the first African-American woman to be allowed at an previously all-white university. So we're seeing cracks in segregation. And we can see this in popular culture. One of my favorite novels is To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee, which is a story of a lynching in the 1930s. But what's interesting is that, it's an incredible novel, later made into a fabulous movie, but yet you would never realize that this is a book about race. So we were writing books about this, winning Pulitzer Prizes, but at the same time, we weren't quite being upfront about it. John F. Kennedy, the first Irish Catholic to become president, began to campaign in the Black community, one of the first white candidates to do that. But at the same time, this is always interesting to me. Usually you always show a photograph of you shaking people's hands. And it's not an accident that the photo of him with African Americans, he's got his hands in his pockets. He is not touching them. It's not a complete accident. But he definitely was a new type of candidate. And, by the early 60s, it had become kind of hip, if you were young, to support ending segregation. People like Peter, Paul, and Mary and Bob Dylan were singing songs about how terrible racism was and how awful. Bob Dylan had a song called The Ballad of Emmett Till. and singing songs like black gospel songs. This song was originally called "I Shall Overcome," very famous song going back to the time of slavery, but was renamed "We Shall Overcome." This idea of let's bring all Americans together as one. And we do again start to see other aspects of the federal government change. For instance, 24th Amendment ended poll tax, which is one of the things that kept so many African Americans from voting. There was a march on Washington. That was, some of the biggest celebrities of their day, Charlton Heston, Marlon Brando joining black activists on and in DC to hear a series of speeches. And of course, that march on Washington is most famous for Martin Luther King's speech, the I Have a Dream speech. What's interesting, a lot of people don't realize that this had very much a political component. The United States, by this point, was fighting communism. We had already, sorry, I had to mess with the mic. Hope it didn't make much sound. Sorry. We were fighting communism. We'd already fought the Nazis. We portrayed ourselves as a nation better than other people. But Martin Luther King in D.C. in front of the Lincoln Memorial said, hold on a second. Not all Americans are free. Not all Americans are living the dream. And apparently John F. Kennedy was furious when he heard the speech because he thought it was embarrassing to America. But that's why he did it, because it worked. We start seeing massive changes after this. Unfortunately, John F. Kennedy was assassinated in November of 1963, but his vice president, that senator from Texas, Lyndon Johnson, helped push through a lot of civil rights laws. And as changes are beginning to happen, we also unfortunately see the rise in violence. In Birmingham, Alabama, a member of the KKK put dynamite in the basement of a church in Birmingham that blew up a Sunday school and killed these 4 children. A civil rights activist in Mississippi were murdered. And it wasn't until the 2000s that the guy who killed them actually was brought to justice. So these violent resistance actually, oddly enough, helped the movement. Because when you see those 4 kids being killed, even if you were a segregationist, it's hard to support that. So that helped get through the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which said no more literacy tests, or if you are going to do, they have to be equal, which basically that meant they no longer happen, because that means a lot of white people might fail them. No more segregation in the public, so public schools and anything the public can go to, like stores and stuff, can't be segregated anymore. And employers can no longer discriminate, not only against race or religion, but also sex. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 probably helped women of all colors more than it even helped out African Americans. And then finally, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which outlawed all poll tax, literacy tests, everything. The first one started working on this. This one equalized voting. Now, there's going to be a lot more laws and stuff being passed. Again, this is 1965. Some of the big stuff doesn't happen until the late 60s. But the reality is that with these federal laws, the basic goals of the Civil Rights Act was indeed achieved. It didn't seem like it in 1965, but once everyone can vote, and once everyone, at least officially, is not supposed to be discriminated against, these changes will slowly filter down to the state level, then the county level, and then the local level. So because of time, I'm trying to keep this under an hour. I'm going to stop here, even though I could still keep going to talk about other issues. But this is the main achievements of the civil rights movement. But again, it took 30, 40 years later before we realized, oh, these are the key changes. All right, with that abbreviated version of this lecture, I'm going to end it. Thank you guys, and I'll talk to you later.